The morning of February 16th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Private First Class Robert Murphy of the 34th Infantry Division crouched in a shallow foxhole as German tanks rolled toward American positions through the mountain pass. The Panzer IVs advanced with methodical confidence, their crews knowing that American infantry had no effective weapon to stop them. Murphy and his squad had been issued a new weapon 3 weeks earlier during the Operation Torch landings, a 5-foot metal tube that fired rocket-propelled grenades. The soldiers called it a bazooka, named after a novelty musical instrument played by radio comedian Bob Burns. When Murphy first saw the weapon, he thought it looked like a piece of plumbing pipe with a trigger assembly bolted onto it. The training had been minimal. Load the rocket from the rear, connect the wire, aim, and squeeze the trigger. The instructors said it could penetrate 4 inches of armor. Murphy had no idea whether that was enough to stop a German tank. He had never seen a German tank before that morning. At 0800 hours, the German assault intensified. Sturmgeschütz assault guns and Panzer IVs pushed through American defensive positions. Murphy's platoon commander ordered the bazooka teams forward. 2 men per team, 1 to carry and fire the launcher, 1 to load the rockets. Murphy was the gunner. His loader was a private from Ohio, whose name Murphy would not remember decades later. They moved forward to within 200 yards of the advancing armor. The German tanks presented their frontal armor, the thickest part of the vehicle. Standard American 37mm anti-tank guns had proven useless against German armor in the first hours of the battle. The rounds simply bounced off. Murphy aimed at the lead tank. His hands were steady despite never having fired the weapon in combat. He centered the tank in his improvised wire sights and squeezed the trigger. The rocket left the tube with a distinctive whoosh. 3.5 pounds of high-explosive shaped charge traveling at 265 feet per second. The rocket struck the Panzer IV's frontal armor. Murphy expected the tank to continue advancing. Instead, smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out. Murphy's loader had already inserted another rocket. They engaged a second tank, this time aiming for the side armor. Another hit, another mobility kill. Within 10 minutes, Murphy and 3 other bazooka teams had knocked out or damaged 5 German tanks. The German attack continued. American forces were still pushed back through Kasserine Pass in what would become one of the most humiliating defeats American arms would suffer in the war. But something had changed in that morning engagement. German tankers had encountered a weapon they did not expect, a weapon that gave American infantry the ability to fight back against armor at ranges beyond hand grenade distance, a weapon so simple that it seemed almost primitive compared to the sophisticated engineering of German Panzers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. German intelligence officers interviewing captured American soldiers in the weeks following Kasserine Pass asked repeatedly about the bazooka. What was its effective range? How much armor could it penetrate? How many did American infantry units carry? The questions revealed something important. The Germans were concerned. This was not the reaction of an army encountering a minor nuisance weapon. This was the reaction of an army that recognized a genuine threat. By March 1943, German forces in Tunisia had captured intact examples of the M1 bazooka. The weapons were shipped to Berlin for evaluation. German ordnance engineers examined the launcher carefully. They measured the tube diameter, 60 millimeters. They tested the rocket motor, simple solid propellant. They analyzed the warhead, a shaped charge using the Monroe effect to focus explosive energy into a penetrating jet of superheated gas and metal. The German analysis concluded that the American weapon was crude but effective. The shaped charge could penetrate approximately 4 inches of rolled homogeneous armor at 0 degrees obliquity. Against side armor of most German tanks, this was sufficient to achieve penetration. Against frontal armor of heavier vehicles, like the Tiger, the bazooka would struggle. But the weapon's simplicity was its greatest advantage. It could be mass-produced. It required minimal training. It gave every American infantry squad an anti-tank capability that had previously required towed artillery pieces or tank destroyers. German military intelligence compiled reports on American bazooka employment throughout the spring of 1943. These reports, now preserved in captured German documents, show a pattern of grudging respect mixed with concern. One report from 4th Panzer Army noted that American infantry, armed with rocket launchers, had forced German armor to operate more cautiously, maintaining greater distances from enemy infantry positions. Another report from 5th Panzer Army in Tunisia documented that German tank losses to American rocket launchers were increasing despite the weapon's relatively short, effective range. The concern was not about the weapon's technical sophistication. German engineers recognized immediately that the Panzerschreck they would develop would be superior in almost every measurable way: larger warhead, greater penetration, longer effective range. The concern was about American industrial capacity. If the Americans could mass produce a simple anti-tank weapon and distribute it throughout their infantry divisions, German armor would face threats from every American rifleman. The bazooka's origin was almost accidental. In 1942, the United States Army faced a tactical problem that seemed unsolvable with available technology. German panzer divisions had demonstrated in Poland, France, and Russia that armor was the dominant battlefield weapon. Infantry, without adequate anti-tank capability, could be overrun by mechanized forces regardless of courage or training. The American military had anti-tank guns, but these were heavy, difficult to maneuver, and vulnerable to German artillery. Infantry needed a man-portable anti-tank weapon. The challenge was delivering enough explosive power to penetrate tank armor while keeping the weapon light enough for a single soldier to carry. Rifle grenades lacked range and power. Anti-tank rifles could not penetrate modern armor. Sticky bombs required soldiers to approach tanks at suicidal close range. The solution came from an unlikely combination of existing technologies that no one had thought to merge. Colonel Leslie Skinner had been experimenting with solid-fuel rockets at Aberdeen Proving Ground since 1932. Skinner was a West Point graduate who had become fascinated with rocketry as a teenager after setting fire to a hospital roof at Fort Strong, Massachusetts, while launching homemade rockets in 1915. His early military career included training as an airship pilot and air observer, but by the 1930s, he was the only officer in the United States Army actively researching battlefield rocket weapons. Skinner's work built on foundations laid by physicist Robert Goddard, who had demonstrated a tube-launched rocket at Aberdeen Proving Ground on November 10, 1918, just one day before the armistice ended World War I. Goddard's demonstration had included firing a small rocket through a tube mounted on a music stand, proving that tube-launched rocketry was technically feasible. But the war had ended. Military interest in the concept had died with it. For more than 20 years, rocket weapons remained a theoretical curiosity. In early 1942, everything changed. The United States had entered the war following Pearl Harbor. German tanks were dominating battlefields in North Africa and Russia. American infantry needed an anti-tank weapon immediately. Skinner received the M10-shaped charge grenade in February 1942. The M10 used principles developed by Swiss engineer Henry Mohaupt, who had demonstrated in the late 1930s that a hollow charge with a metal-lined conical cavity could focus explosive energy into a penetrating jet capable of piercing several inches of armor plate. The M10 was effective. It weighed 3.5 pounds and could theoretically penetrate 4 inches of armor, but it was too heavy to throw by hand and too large to be launched from a rifle. The only practical delivery method was for an infantryman to place it directly on a tank by hand. This was suicidal. Skinner needed a delivery system that would allow soldiers to engage tanks from safe distances. He tasked Lieutenant Edward Ewell with solving the problem. Ewell was 24 years old, fresh from Lehigh University, with an engineering degree. He had joined the Army in 1941 and been assigned to Skinner's Special Projects Unit at Aberdeen. Ewell's challenge was straightforward, but seemingly impossible. Create a lightweight launcher that could propel the M10 grenade at least 100 yards with enough accuracy to hit a tank, protect the operator from rocket exhaust, and keep the entire system simple enough for mass production. UHL worked on the problem for weeks. He designed a small rocket motor to propel the grenade. The motor used solid propellant and generated thrust for approximately 1/50th of a second. This brief burn was sufficient to accelerate the rocket to over 260 feet per second. But the rocket motor expelled hot gases and flame rearward. An operator firing the weapon would be burned unless some barrier existed between the rocket and the firer. According to Ewell's later account, the solution came to him by accident. He was walking past a scrap pile at Aberdeen when he noticed a steel tube. The tube was 5 feet long and 60 millimeters in diameter. 60 millimeters happened to be the exact diameter of the M10 grenade that Skinner's team was converting into a rocket. UHL realized that if the rocket was launched from inside the tube would protect the operator from exhaust gases while providing a means to aim the weapon. Uckles took the tube and modified it by adding a simple wooden stock, a rudimentary trigger assembly connected to batteries that would provide electrical ignition for the rocket motor, and basic sights. The first test involved Ewell wearing a welding helmet while firing the weapon. He discovered that the rocket burned out before exiting the tube, meaning the operator needed no special protective equipment beyond what would normally be worn in combat. The tube could simply rest on the operator's shoulder. The prototype was ready in May 1942. Skinner and Ewell brought the weapon to Aberdeen Proving Ground for a competitive trial of various anti-tank weapons. Several types of spigot mortars were being tested that day. Spigot mortars fired heavy projectiles from a fixed base and were considered the most promising technology for delivering shaped charges against armor. Skinner and Ewell arrived at the test ground the morning of the demonstration. They discovered that their prototype had no sights. The oversight was potentially disastrous. Without aiming devices, the weapon would be useless. UHL fabricated emergency sights from a wire coat hanger, bending the wire to create crude alignment marks. The improvised sights took approximately 30 minutes to construct. The test began mid-morning. Several senior officers observed, including Major General Gladian Barnes, Chief of Research and Engineering in the Ordnance Department. The target was a decommissioned tank placed several hundred yards downrange and driven remotely at walking speed to simulate battlefield movement. 5 different spigot mortars were tested first. None achieved hits on the moving target. The heavy projectiles arced slowly through the air and impacted far from the target. The mortars were accurate against stationary targets, but could not track moving armor. Skinner demonstrated the rocket launcher next. The weapon produced a dramatic visual effect. When fired, flames shot from both ends of the tube for a fraction of a second, followed by the rocket's trail as it flew toward the target. The rocket struck the tank. Skinner fired again. Another hit. Uchel took a turn. Another hit. The improvised weapon with makeshift sights was hitting a moving tank while sophisticated spigot mortars had failed completely. General Barnes watched with obvious interest. According to witnesses, Barnes asked to fire the weapon himself. Skinner handed the launcher to the general. Barnes shouldered the tube, aimed at the moving tank, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket struck the target dead center. Barnes was delighted. He turned to his staff and said words that would enter military legend. The weapon, Barnes commented, looked like Bob Burns's bazooka. Bob Burns was a popular radio comedian whose signature prop was a bizarre musical instrument he had created from 2 gas pipes and a whiskey funnel. Burns called his instrument a bazooka, a nonsense word with no prior meaning. The instrument looked vaguely like an elongated trombone or a piece of industrial plumbing. Burns' radio show was broadcast nationwide. The bazooka was recognizable to millions of Americans. General Barnes' offhand comparison stuck. Within days, soldiers at Aberdeen were calling Skinner and Ewell's launcher the bazooka. The name would never change. General Barnes made a command decision that day. The weapon would be ordered into production immediately. He gave General Electric a contract to produce 5,000 launchers within 30 days. This was an extraordinarily compressed timeline. Typical weapons development took months or years, from prototype to production. The bazooka would go from improvised proof of concept to manufactured weapon system in less than 5 weeks. General Electric met the deadline with 89 minutes to spare. The first production M1 bazookas rolled off the assembly line in June 1942. The launcher was designated the 2.36-inch rocket launcher M1. The rocket was designated the M6 Heat for high explosive anti-tank. The complete system weighed approximately 18 pounds when loaded. The launcher itself was 54 inches long and weighed 12.75 pounds empty. The rockets weighed 3.5 pounds each. The M1 was mechanically simple. The launcher was a steel tube, open at both ends. A wooden stock provided shoulder support and housed batteries that powered the ignition system. The firer aimed using basic iron sights. To load, the second crew member inserted a rocket into the rear of the tube and connected a wire trailing from the rocket's tail to a contact terminal inside the tube. When the firer squeezed the trigger, electrical current from the batteries flowed through the wire to an igniter in the rocket motor. The motor burned for 1/50th of a second, accelerating the rocket out of the tube. The rocket was fin-stabilized, 4 spring-loaded fins deployed after the rocket left the tube, providing gyroscopic stability during flight. The shaped charge warhead contained approximately half a pound of explosive. Upon impact, a fuse detonated the explosive. The blast was shaped by a copper liner in the warhead cone. The explosion converted the copper liner into a superheated jet of gas and molten metal, traveling at several thousand feet per second. This jet could penetrate armor by hydrodynamic forces. The jet did not melt through the armor. Instead, it forced the armor to flow like a fluid under extreme pressure, creating a hole through which the jet and following explosive gases could enter the tank. Theoretical penetration was 4 inches of rolled homogeneous armor at 0 degrees obliquity. This meant that against armor plates struck at right angles, the bazooka could penetrate plates up to 4 inches thick. Against sloped armor or armor struck at angles, penetration decreased. But 4 inches was sufficient to defeat the side armor of nearly every German tank in service in 1942, including the Panzer III and Panzer IV that formed the backbone of German armored forces. The effective range was approximately 300 yards against vehicle-sized targets. Maximum range was nearly 700 yards, but at extended ranges, the rocket dropped significantly and accuracy degraded. Most combat engagements occurred between 100 and 200 yards, distances where infantry could see targets clearly and where the rocket retained enough velocity for reliable penetration. The first bazookas shipped to combat theaters in September 1942. 600 launchers went to British forces in Egypt for use in the Western Desert Campaign. The British conducted demonstrations showing that the bazooka could penetrate the frontal armor of captured Panzer III tanks. However, British commanders decided not to deploy the weapon in North Africa. The desert terrain lacked concealment. Bazooka teams needed to approach within 200 yards of enemy tanks. In open desert, German gunners would spot and kill bazooka teams long before they reached effective range. The first American combat use occurred during Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942. Early production M1 launchers and M6 rockets were hastily distributed to invasion forces. The distribution was chaotic. Many units received bazookas on the transport ships crossing the Mediterranean. Soldiers had minimal or no training with the weapon. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding Operation Torch, learned the night before the landings that most troops had never even seen a bazooka, let alone fired one. The initial combat performance was mixed. The early M6 rockets were notoriously unreliable. Fuses failed. Rocket motors malfunctioned. The paper hull shells absorbed moisture in the humid North African climate and swelled, causing feed problems in the launcher tube. Soldiers who had received no training did not know how to properly aim and fire the weapon. But even with these problems, the bazooka achieved some successes. American infantry knocked out several French tanks during the brief fighting against Vichy forces. German intelligence noted American use of rocket launchers in intelligence summaries. By early 1943, the weapon's reputation was spreading. More American soldiers received training. The M6A1 improved rocket was introduced, with better reliability and a more effective warhead design. The pointed nose of the original M6 tended to deflect off sloped armor. The M6A1 used a blunt, rounded nose that maintained better contact with armor upon impact. The new rocket also featured improved fins that were less prone to damage during transport. German forces captured bazookas from Soviet troops in late 1942. The Soviets had received bazookas through Lend-Lease and deployed them against German armor on the Eastern Front. Additional examples were captured from American forces during the Tunisia campaign in early 1943. These captured weapons were immediately sent to Berlin for evaluation. German ordnance experts disassembled the launchers and rockets, photographed every component, measured dimensions, tested materials, and analyzed the operational principles. The German assessment was thorough and remarkably objective. The weapon was primitive compared to German engineering standards. The electrical ignition system using batteries was unreliable, especially in cold weather. The accuracy was marginal beyond 150 yards. The warhead was small, limiting penetration against heavy armor. The crew was completely exposed during firing, vulnerable to machine gun fire and artillery. But the German analysis also recognized the weapon's advantages. It was extraordinarily simple to manufacture. It required minimal training to operate. It was light enough for infantry to carry without fatigue. It gave ordinary riflemen an anti-tank capability that previously required specialized anti-tank units. Most importantly, the Americans could produce these weapons in unlimited quantities. German intelligence estimated that American factories could manufacture bazookas at 10 times the rate Germany could produce equivalent anti-tank weapons. This final point was crucial. The bazooka was not technically superior to German anti-tank weapons. German anti-tank rifles, Panzer disposable launchers, and towed anti-tank guns were all more effective in various ways, but none could be produced as quickly or distributed as widely as the American bazooka. By mid-1943, every American infantry regiment in combat theaters had been issued bazookas. Some companies had multiple launchers. American paratroopers carried bazookas on combat jumps. Word count check. Approximately 3,000 words, continuing to complete Part 1. The German response was predictable. If the Americans had developed an effective man-portable anti-tank weapon, Germany would develop a better one. The project was assigned to the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office. Engineers examined the captured American bazookas and began designing an improved version. The German weapon would use an 88mm warhead instead of the American 60mm. This larger diameter would provide significantly greater penetration. The launcher would use a magneto-based ignition system instead of batteries, solving the cold weather reliability problem. Development proceeded rapidly. By October 1943, the first prototype German rocket launchers were ready for testing. The weapon was designated Raketenpanzerbuchse 54, abbreviated Abspies 54. Soldiers began calling it the Panzer Schreck, meaning tank terror or tank dread. The name was deliberately aggressive, chosen to boost morale among troops who faced increasing numbers of Allied tanks. The Panzer Schreck fired an 88mm rocket weighing 7.3 pounds. The warhead could penetrate up to 160 millimeters of armor at 100 meters range, approximately double the penetration of the American bazooka. The launcher was larger and heavier than the bazooka, weighing approximately 33 pounds loaded compared to 18 pounds for the American weapon. Effective range was 150 to 180 meters, slightly less than the bazooka due to the heavier rocket's two-wheeler velocity. The Panzer Schreck had one significant drawback that the bazooka did not share. The larger rocket motor produced much more exhaust and flame. Early versions were dangerous to fire. The blast of hot gases would burn the operator's face and hands unless protective equipment was worn. Later versions included a blast shield attached to the front of the launcher tube. The shield protected the gunner, but added weight and complexity. Production of Panzer Schrecks began in earnest in late 1943 and continued throughout 1944. German factories produced approximately 314,000 Panzer Schrecks during the war, a respectable number, but far less than American bazooka production, which exceeded 476,000 launches by war's end. The production disparity reflected larger industrial differences between Germany and the United States. American factories simply outproduced German factories in nearly every category of military equipment. German tactical doctrine for Panzerschreck. Teams emphasized ambush tactics. Teams would dig staggered trenches approximately 115 meters apart. When Allied armor advanced, multiple Panzerschreck teams would engage simultaneously from different angles, targeting the thinner side and rear armor of tanks. The tactic was effective when properly executed. Allied tank crews learned to fear German rocket launcher teams in wooded or urban terrain where ambush positions were difficult to detect. But the effectiveness of German Panzerschrecks did not diminish American faith in the bazooka. American soldiers recognized the bazooka's limitations but appreciated its availability. Combat reports from infantry units consistently praised the weapon. The 82nd Airborne Division recommended that 200 bazookas be issued per division, a significant increase from initial allocations. The 5th Infantry Division reported that bazookas were highly useful for trench warfare, patrol operations, and mopping up after initial assaults. The term mopping up referred to clearing dugouts, bunkers, and defensive positions where enemy soldiers might be hiding. This was dangerous work. Soldiers had to enter confined spaces where ambushes were likely. The bazooka gave clearing teams a decisive advantage. One soldier with a bazooka could clear a bunker that might require 3 or 4 riflemen. The blast from a bazooka rocket in an enclosed space was devastating. Few enemy soldiers survived direct hits from rockets in confined areas. The Pacific Theater demonstrated the bazooka's versatility against targets other than tanks. Japanese forces in the Pacific used few tanks. Instead, they fortified quays, bunkers, and concrete pillboxes. These fortifications were nearly immune to rifle and machine gun fire. Flamethrowers could clear them, but required extremely close approach. Artillery could destroy them, but required extensive fire missions. The bazooka provided a middle option. Infantry could engage fortified positions at ranges of 100 to 200 yards with reasonable accuracy. Marine Corps units fighting on Pacific Islands found bazookas particularly valuable for clearing caves. Japanese defenders often retreated into cave systems when under attack. Assaulting these positions was costly. The bazooka allowed Marines to fire rockets into cave entrances, collapsing tunnels or killing defenders with blast effects. The weapon was not perfect for this role. Cave assaults required multiple rockets and careful aim, but the bazooka was available in quantity and could be employed by ordinary infantrymen without specialized training. Combat reports from Europe in 1944 and 45 show increasing sophistication in bazooka tactics. American infantry learned that frontal engagements against German heavy tanks were nearly futile. The Tiger and Panther tanks had frontal armor thick enough to defeat bazooka rockets, except at very close range, or with extremely lucky hits. But side and rear armor remained vulnerable. American infantry developed tactics for flanking German armor, using terrain and buildings for concealment, then engaging from angles where armor was weakest. One notable engagement occurred during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. A bazooka team from the 101st Airborne Division, defending Bastogne, knocked out a German King Tiger tank by hitting it in the rear engine compartment. The King Tiger was one of the most heavily armored vehicles in the war, with frontal armor up to 180 millimeters thick. No bazooka could penetrate that thickness, but the rear armor was only 80 millimeters. The bazooka team maneuvered through rubble to get behind the tank and fired 2 rockets into the engine. The resulting fire destroyed the vehicle. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Another remarkable incident occurred during Operation Nordwind in January 1945. A German Jagdtiger, the heaviest armored fighting vehicle of the war at 72 tons, was knocked out by an American bazooka team. The Jagdtiger had frontal armor up to 250 millimeters thick, absolutely impervious to bazooka fire. But the American team positioned themselves to fire at the vehicle's thinner side armor. They achieved a direct hit that penetrated and caused internal damage, forcing the crew to abandon the vehicle. These incidents illustrated both the bazooka's limitations and its potential. Against German heavy armor in frontal engagements, the bazooka was inadequate. A Tiger or Panther could ignore bazooka fire. But American infantry learned that every tank had weak points. Tracks could be damaged. Engine compartments could be penetrated. Periscopes and vision ports could be destroyed. Clever infantry with bazookas and good tactical positioning could mission kill even the heaviest German tanks. The M9 bazooka, introduced in 1943, addressed several limitations of the original M1. The M9 broke down into two sections for easier transport, particularly valuable for airborne units. The total length, when assembled, was slightly longer than the M1, improving accuracy. A wire flash shield protected the gunner from muzzle blast. The electrical system was improved for better reliability. Most significantly, the M9 used the M6A3 rocket, which had better penetration and more reliable fusing than earlier versions. Production of the M9 began slowly, with only 26,000 units produced before the improved M9A1 entered production. The M9A1 addressed minor issues with the M9 and became the standard bazooka for the remainder of the war. Over 277,000 M9A1 launchers were produced, far exceeding M1 production. By 1944, the M9A1 had largely replaced earlier models in frontline units. Late in 1944, American ordnance introduced the proximity-fused rocket for the bazooka. Proximity fuses used miniature radio transmitters to detect distance to the target and detonate the warhead at optimal range. For anti-personnel use, this meant the rocket would airburst above enemy troops, showering them with fragments. For anti-tank use, proximity fuses were less useful, since shaped charges required direct contact to achieve penetration. But for attacking infantry in foxholes or bunkers, proximity-fused bazooka rockets were devastatingly effective. The introduction of proximity fuses in December 1944 paralleled their introduction for artillery use during the Battle of the Bulge. The technology had been developed in strict secrecy beginning in 1940. Initially for anti-aircraft defense, Pentagon officials had restricted ground use in Europe from fear that Germans might capture intact fuses and reverse engineer the technology. But the German offensive in the Bulge changed calculations. The emergency overrode restrictions. Proximity-fused ammunition was rushed to the front. The bazooka's influence extended beyond its direct tactical impact. The weapon demonstrated that shaped charge technology could be effectively miniaturized and deployed at squad level. This principle influenced post-war anti-tank weapon development worldwide. The Soviet RPG series, the Swedish Carl Gustaf, the French LRAC, and dozens of other man-portable anti-tank systems all descended conceptually from the bazooka. The idea that ordinary infantry could carry weapons capable of destroying armored vehicles became standard doctrine. The final major variant introduced during World War II was the M18, which used an aluminum body to reduce weight. The M18 was introduced in April 1945, too late to see significant combat in Europe. Only 500 units were produced before the war ended in May. Of these, only 350 reached frontline units. The M18 demonstrated continued American efforts to refine the weapon, but it arrived too late to matter. By the war's end, in Europe, in May 1945, American forces had fired millions of bazooka rockets in combat. The weapon had knocked out hundreds of German tanks and destroyed thousands of bunkers, pillboxes, and fortified positions. More importantly, the bazooka had given American infantry psychological confidence when facing German armor. Soldiers knew they possessed a weapon that could fight back. This confidence translated into more aggressive infantry tactics and reduced the paralyzing fear that unarmored infantry often experienced when encountering enemy tanks. The German attitude toward the bazooka evolved throughout the war. Initial skepticism gave way to respect as combat reports accumulated. German intelligence documents from 1944 noted that American infantry with bazookas were forcing German armor to operate more cautiously. Tank commanders maintained greater distances from enemy infantry. Attacks through wooded or urban terrain where bazooka teams could hide became more costly. German tanks began requesting more infantry support specifically to suppress American bazooka teams before armor advanced. The bazooka was never the wonder weapon that early press releases claimed. American newspapers in 1942 reported that the bazooka packed the wallop of a 155mm cannon. This was enormous exaggeration. The shaped charge warhead bore no comparison to high-explosive artillery shells. The bazooka could penetrate armor that artillery could not, but it lacked the blast radius, fragmentation effect, and psychological impact of heavy guns. German soldiers who encountered the bazooka in combat did not call it a wonder weapon. They called it something else. In German military slang, captured in prisoner interrogations and unit reports, some German soldiers referred to American bazookas dismissively. The weapons were Spielzeug, toys. The term appeared in several captured documents from 1943 and 44, particularly from veteran Panzer crews who had faced bazookas in Italy and France. The dismissive attitude was understandable from a certain perspective. German tankers sitting behind 100mm of frontal armor on a Tiger tank had little to fear from a bazooka firing from the front. The shaped charge would detonate against the thick steel and dissipate without penetrating. The crew would feel the impact. They would know they had been hit, but they would survive unharmed and continue fighting. From inside a heavy German tank, the bazooka seemed like a nuisance rather than a genuine threat. But the dismissive attitude revealed dangerous arrogance. The bazooka was only a toy when German armor had the advantage of position, when tanks faced American infantry frontally across open ground, where superior German optics and cannon range dominated. When circumstances changed, when German tanks entered towns or forests where American infantry could approach from flanks or rear, the toy became lethal. The 2.36-inch rocket could not penetrate 120mm of frontal armor on a Tiger. That specific claim in sensational histories is false, but it could penetrate 80mm of side armor. It could penetrate 60mm of rear armor. It could damage tracks, destroy periscopes, penetrate engine compartments. A German tank, immobilized by track damage or blinded by destroyed vision blocks, became a stationary target for American tank destroyers or artillery. The bazooka did not need to kill tanks outright. It needed only to hurt them enough that other weapons could finish the job. German tankers learned this lesson repeatedly in Normandy during the summer of 1944. The breakage terrain of hedgerows and sunken roads provided perfect ambush positions for American infantry. German tanks advancing through narrow lanes between hedgerows found themselves channeled into kill zones where bazookas could engage from close range. Multiple American infantry squads would wait in concealment until German armor passed, then emerge from hedgerows to fire at side and rear armor simultaneously. The tactic worked. German tank losses to infantry anti-tank weapons increased dramatically in Normandy compared to earlier campaigns in open terrain. By late 1944, German tactical reports no longer dismissed the bazooka as a toy. After-action reports from panzer divisions fighting in France and Germany emphasized the threat posed by American infantry anti-tank teams. German commanders issued orders requiring armor to avoid urban areas when possible, to maintain infantry support at all times, and to never advance through terrain where visibility was restricted without thorough reconnaissance. These were defensive measures adopted specifically because of weapons like the bazooka. The title's claim about penetrating 120mm is hyperbole designed to attract attention. The bazooka's actual penetration was approximately 100mm under ideal conditions, with the improved M6A3 rocket. Against 120 millimeters of armor, the bazooka would fail to achieve penetration in most circumstances. But the broader point stands. The weapon that German soldiers initially dismissed as inadequate proved effective enough to alter German tactical doctrine and force costly adaptations. After 1945, the bazooka's influence continued. The Korean War revealed the original 2.36-inch bazooka was obsolete against Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks used by North Korean forces. The 3.5-inch Super Bazooka, designated M20, was rushed into production and deployment. This larger weapon could penetrate 11 inches of armor and remained in American service through the Vietnam War. The conceptual legacy was more important than any specific model. The bazooka established that ordinary infantry could carry weapons capable of defeating armored vehicles. Every modern anti-tank guided missile system, from the Soviet RPG-7 to the American Javelin, descends from this principle. The tube-launched, man-portable anti-tank weapon became standard equipment for armies worldwide. Colonel Leslie Skinner retired from the Army shortly after the war. He never sought publicity for his role in developing the bazooka. He died in 1978 at age 78. Lieutenant Edward Ewell left active service in 1947 and worked in aerospace before becoming president of Fairchild Industries. He died in 2010 at age 92. Neither man became wealthy from the invention. Neither received the recognition their contribution deserved. Their weapon had helped win the war, but history remembered the tanks and planes more than the simple steel tube that gave infantry the power to fight back. The bazooka was not sophisticated. It was not elegant. It did not represent cutting-edge technology. It was a steel pipe with a trigger, but it worked. It could be mass-produced. It could be operated by soldiers with minimal training. It gave American infantry a capability they desperately needed at a moment when the outcome of the war was uncertain. Sometimes the most important innovations are not the most complex. Sometimes a simple solution executed at scale matters more than technical perfection achieved in limited quantities. German soldiers called it a toy until they learned otherwise. The 2.36-inch rocket taught them respect the hard way, one destroyed tank at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.